Map global trade across the Eastern Hemisphere, and the vast web of supply chains funnels into three specific maritime bottlenecks. The global economy relies almost entirely on continuous shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and the Taiwan Strait. For decades, controlling these arteries required a dominant blue water navy. Today, weaker states can lock down these massive transit routes using relatively cheap technologies. Relatively cheap coastal radar, shore-based anti-ship missiles, and commercial drones allow smaller militaries to impose massive costs on stronger adversaries. We just saw a successful test run of this asymmetric model. When Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps moved to close the Strait of Hormuz, they choked off Middle Eastern oil exports and spiked global energy prices using naval mines, drones, and fast attack boats. The crisis revealed a critical vulnerability in the international order. Major powers demonstrated an active willingness to tolerate widespread economic disruption and to completely disregard the international laws governing maritime transit. This willingness sets a dangerous precedent for Asia. But while Hormuz is largely an energy choke point, Asia's waterways sit at the center of the world's total trade and semiconductor supply chains. Disrupting these routes would not just impact oil, it would threaten the manufacturing and advanced semiconductor supply chains that sustain the modern economy. Iran proved that a weaker power can feasibly weaponize a choke point. Replicating that tactic in the Indo-Pacific would trigger a shock capable of paralyzing global tech industries. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, straits 24 nautical miles or narrower grant vessels transit passage, unimpeded navigation, and overflight. Outside these corridors, innocent passage applies, allowing security suspensions and requiring submarines to surface. The law of armed conflict at sea maintains these maritime rights even during active warfare. Non-belligerent neutral shipping retains the right to pass, and belligerents are strictly prohibited from establishing blanket bans on transit. During the Hormuz crisis, Iran broke these rules by establishing a structured toll system requiring shipping companies to pay millions of dollars to pass and threatening to set ships ablaze. Tehran directly violated the right of transit passage. But the initial U.S. executive response also stood outside the bounds of international law. A presidential directive threatened a blanket blockade on any and all ships entering or leaving the strait, explicitly contravening the law of armed conflict. To make the order legally defensible, U.S. Central Command narrowed the parameters to enforce the blockade only against vessels entering or departing Iranian ports, deliberately preserving transit rights for neutral vessels traveling elsewhere. The Hormuz crisis demonstrated both the feasibility of weaponizing a choke point and a newfound willingness by major powers to tolerate the resulting economic fallout. In a crisis, the perceived military advantage of controlling these straits is now likely to outweigh the legal constraints that once protected them. Apply this disruption model to the Strait of Malacca. At its narrowest point, this bottleneck is just 1.5 nautical miles wide. That tiny physical gap carries up to 40% of global trade and 80% of China's total energy imports. Beijing is acutely aware of this vulnerability. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao officially termed this strategic exposure as the Malacca Dilemma. If the Strait of Malacca were severed, or if littoral states decided to extract extortionate tolls under the guise of an environmental levy, the global macroeconomic fallout would be immediate. China is actively maneuvering to bypass this vulnerability by expanding overland pipelines through Myanmar, Russia, and Central Asia to secure energy imports without relying on the strait. The rest of the world has no such bypass. The Strait of Malacca is the primary corridor linking East Asian manufacturing hubs to European markets. Choking it instantly severs the primary supply chains linking Asian production to the West. Moving further north, the Taiwan Strait presents a different physical reality. At roughly 70 nautical miles across at its narrowest, it is significantly wider than Hormuz or Malacca. But the economic concentration here is absolute. Taiwan is the world's dominant producer of advanced semiconductors, the essential component for global tech and defense production. Taiwan faces a stark geographic trap. Its major ports are highly concentrated on its west coast, facing the strait directly. With a mountainous interior complicating east-to-west transport, the island lacks any geographical bypass. If those ports are restricted, global tech industries paralyze, raw materials stop entering, critical chips stop exiting, and an estimated 5.3% of global GDP is erased. Securing these straits provides a distinct operational advantage, allowing a local force to restrict access and impose costs on superior navies trying to intervene. China utilizes an anti-access area denial strategy, using dense layers of shore-based missiles and surveillance to restrict adversary operations. Taiwan answers with a porcupine approach, relying on highly dispersed mobile defense systems designed to repel an invasion. Directly to the south lies the Luzon Strait. This waterway connects the South China Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and its extreme depth makes it a critical transit route for submarines moving undetected. The United States and the Philippines recently focused joint military exercises on developing localized denial capabilities squarely within the Luzon Strait. Because these straits are wider than 24 nautical miles, high seas freedoms technically apply, but the immense strategic value of the semiconductor trade and deep-water access makes it highly probable that legal constraints will be ignored in a crisis. When primary choke points face disruption, global shipping is forced to divert. If the Strait of Malacca is constrained, maritime traffic has to move south, routing directly through the Indonesian archipelago. This forces vessels into secondary deep-water trenches, like the Sunda and Lombok Straits. Here, archipelagic sea lanes passage guarantees unimpeded navigation, but only if vessels remain strictly within narrow, state-designated corridors. Outside these routes, normal high seas freedoms do not apply. Funneling massive volumes of global traffic into highly predictable corridors creates an acute tactical vulnerability. The ships become exceptionally easy to track and target. Major powers are already maneuvering to exploit this. Recently, an unmanned underwater vehicle was discovered in the Lombok Strait, indicating active preparation to monitor and contest these secondary choke points. Relying on secondary archipelagic routes does not actually secure the supply chain. It simply forces global trade diversions into tighter, more predictable kill boxes. The assault on the Strait of Hormuz shows that international norms do not endure on their own. Without a sustained defense of transit rights, the same dynamics of disruption and extortion can be replicated across the Indo-Pacific. The first immediate requirement is bolstering maritime domain awareness. The United States must expand intelligence sharing and coastal surveillance capabilities with key maritime partners like Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia to detect disruption early. Next is the physical infrastructure. Washington and its regional allies need to rapidly upgrade secondary deepwater ports in places like the Philippines and Vietnam to ensure they can handle the capacity of diverted shipping traffic. Economically, the concentration of tech production must be addressed. Efforts to decentralize advanced semiconductor manufacturing out of Taiwan and into allied nations like Germany and Japan have to accelerate to reduce the global leverage of a single island blockade. Diplomatically, the United States needs to formally ratify UN clause. Contesting unlawful blockades and defending maritime law requires legal standing, and current U.S. rhetoric must finally align with binding international commitments. Finally, to maximize deterrence, allied nations must pre-commit to a coordinated framework of severe economic sanctions triggered by any unlawful disruption of strategic waterways. The leverage discovered in the Middle East is highly exportable. The sheer volume of global trade dependent on Asia's waterways means that failing to defend these transit rights invites consequences for the entire global economy.